Hello, I'm Olivia Mattis. I'm delighted to welcome you to another one of our Sunday programs here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. We have a highly relevant and important subject today. The political theorist and thinker, Hannah Arendt. And we have a marvelous panel, small panel, just two speakers that I'll introduce shortly. But first, there are a few things I wanted to say. There are two topics that are not mentioned in the film that I wanted to make you aware of. So here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation, we honor a hero, a rescuer of World War II, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who was the Portuguese consul general in France during World War II. So we show stories of rescue, resistance, and hope. And in fact, Hannah Arendt herself was rescued during the Holocaust period. She was rescued by a man named Varian Fry, who was a major important rescuer in the city of Marseille, France. So that's number one. I wanted to make you aware of that fact. And I wanted to have a program on Varian Fry, and I hope to do so, but the Varian Fry film is not yet finished. So once it is, I hope to be able to show it to you and feature his amazing heroic action that maybe we'll talk about a little bit during the Q&A later in the show today. The other thing I wanted to make you aware of is that Hannah Arendt escaped Nazi-occupied Europe via Portugal. She was in Lisbon for 3 months in 1941. So even though she was not personally rescued by our hero, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, she still benefited from his action. Why? Because in 1940, he opened an escape route that did not previously exist. So even people who escaped through Portugal in 1941, 1942, not through his direct intervention, still benefited from the amazing action of our hero, Sousa Mendes. So I wanted to let you know that right off the bat. So we have two speakers, as I said, that we will be hearing from. Our first speaker will be our resident historian. That is Dr. Mordecai Paldiel, who is an expert on pretty much any topic involving World War II. And he was for 24 years at Yad Vashem as the head of the Department for the Righteous. He's written many, many books on non-Jewish rescuers, Jewish rescuers, who is a righteous, who's not a righteous, Holocaust in Poland, pretty much any subject you can think of that's relevant to this history, Mordecai has written about it. So I'm very pleased that he has agreed to speak on today's program about Hannah Arendt. Our second speaker will be the filmmaker. His name is Jeff Bieber, and he has a 40-plus year association with the PBS station in Washington, D.C. He produced Washington Week, and he covered all kinds of important political events in the United States and around the world. And since 2022, he has had his own production company, Jeff Bieber Productions. And it was obviously his idea to create this film. He's going to tell us why he made this film, how he feels it's relevant to what we're living through today in the United States and around the world. And so I couldn't be happier. So we're going to be hearing from Mordecai Paldiel, then we're going to be hearing from Jeff Bieber. Then I will make some announcements, as I usually do. Then we will get to your questions. So you will all stay muted for the entirety of the hour. I ask that when a question comes to your mind, that you write it into the chat box. I will be serving as your moderator today. I will be gathering those questions, and when the time is right, later in the hour, I will be asking them of our speakers. So without further ado, Dr. Mordecai Paldiel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia, and welcome everyone. Today we discuss one of the most important political and philosophical figures who shaped much of our thinking, starting some 50 years ago. Born into a secular Jewish family in pre-Nazi Germany, Hannah Arendt believed, as most other Jews in Germany, that assimilation into German society with minor attachment to Judaism was the linchpin to the survival of the Jewish community there. No wonder she wrote a book about her lauded women hero of the previous half century of Rahel Varnhagen, a famous 19th century Berlin salon host who denied her Judaism, converted and married into a non-Jewish family. Interestingly, as a student at Freiburg University, she chose as her doctoral thesis the idea of love and the writings of Augustine, better known as Saint Augustine, one of the principal church fathers of Christianity and a known theological anti-Semite. As a university student, she, as many others interested in the meaning of human existence, came under the influence of Martin Heidegger, one of the foremost existential thinkers. A close relationship, not merely intellectually, but also romantically and intimate, although he was married and the father of 2 children. She remained loyal to him in spite of his adherence to the Nazi Party and her forceful leaving Nazi Germany for France, where she reasserted her Judaism by helping Jewish youth emigrate to then Palestine as part of the Zionist Youth Aliyah. She then escaped from German-occupied France and settled in the United States, where she lectured and wrote on the dangers of authoritarianism, quite in opposition to her previous intellectual mentor. Heidegger. After the war, she tried to make half-hearted amends with Heidegger and helped him being readmitted in academic circles after initially being ostracized by his colleagues, mindful of his Nazi past. Although he never was a fervent Nazi ideological believer, but just a member of the Nazi Party. And she made him readable to English-speaking audiences by helping the translation of his major existential studies into that language. Although not openly acknowledging it, he did remain the true love of her life. Although she was, after leaving him, happily married, first with the Jewish Gunther Stern, then with the non-Jewish and Marxist Heinrich Blücher. It appears that her friendship with and intimacy with Heidegger triumphed over everything else, despite Heidegger's Nazi past. She stated that Heidegger told her after the war that she had been the passion of his life. Such a notorious liar, she commented. She was, in fact, more in love with him than he in her. Many years after attaining popularity on her writings of totalitarianism, she became embroiled in a passionate debate with what she wrote on Adolf Eichmann and her ideas what constituted evil behavior by persons who she insisted are not necessarily demonically evil, but lack what she termed an imaginative spirit. The Holocaust remained constantly on her mind. On Auschwitz, she has stated that something happened there. She termed it the mass production of corpses, toward which we cannot reconcile ourselves. None of us never can. As for the Jewish response during the Holocaust, she harshly condemned what she termed the collaboration by the Judenräte, the Jewish self-regulating bodies under Nazi supervision across all of Europe, such as Rabbi Dr. Leah Beck, the foremost Jewish religious leader of German Jewry. She condemned them, as she put it, for collaborating, although unwillingly, but compelled so, with their Nazi overlord, and thereby, by their submissiveness, facilitating the German in the destruction of the Jewish leaders' own people. She termed this Jewish submissiveness as the darkest chapter of the whole dark story. As she explained, to save 1,000, they sacrificed 10,000. To save 10,000, they sacrificed 100,000, such as in the story of Rudolf Kastner in Hungary. I will note that many Holocaust historians sharply disagreed with her on this point. As for her writing on the Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, she made clear that the purpose was to take away people's seductive and captivating fascination with the presence of evil in their imagination. As she stated, my intention was to destroy the idea of evil as something demonically great. It was not necessarily demonic and hence an abnormal type of human behavior, but evil could, under special circumstances, assume part of the norm and be part of one's normal behavior. Arendt qualified Eichmann as similar to persons who suffer from the inability to think from the standpoint of someone else, what the other person is thinking and feeling. This is what characterized Eichmann's behavior. There was nothing demonic about it, she stated. The reluctance to imagine what the other person is experiencing. That is what leads, in special circumstances, to what she termed as a banality of evil type of behavior. Most people who commit evil, she further underlined, it is not because they're susceptible to evil deeds, because they blindly carry out the evil design of evil persons. Such was Eichmann. Here too many disagree with her in discounting Eichmann's evil designs while acknowledging his performance of evil deeds, for which Hannah Arendt says he needed to be hanged. She also, in her writing, ridiculed Eichmann's notion in his defense of Immanuel Kant, the noted German Enlightenment philosopher. Kant is best known for the principle of the categorical imperative, as stated by him. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, end of quote. Eichmann claimed that Hitler, as master of Germany, was the standard bearer of his will that obligated all Germans, and he, Eichmann, was only acting in line with Kant's maxim and carrying out the dictates of that person. In other words, as Arendt pointed out, there are no such things as universal laws of what is right and wrong, according to Eichmann. The state and society decide what is morally right and wrong. This, she countered, is a terrible misreading of Kant's philosophy, where universal moral standards overrode any other localized standards by self-appointed dictators. During the Eichmann trial, following the footsteps of other witnesses, Abba Kovner, after recounting the horrific events in the Vilna ghetto, he surprised the court and the audience when he related the good deeds of a German army sergeant. Anton Schmidt, a Viennese 40-year-old reserve soldier in the Wehrmacht, the German army, did something deeply unexpected. He helped Jews of the ghetto and also the Jewish underground there, commanded by Abba Kovner. And he continued aiding them for several months until he was arrested in July 1942, tried by a military court, and executed for treason. The story of his heroic acts moved profoundly Arendt, the court judges, and the audience in the courtroom. As she later wrote, quote, during the few minutes it took Kovner to tell of the help that had come from a German sergeant, a hush settled over the courtroom. It was as though the crowd had spontaneously decided to observe the usual 2 minutes of silence in honor of the man named Anton Schmid. And in those 2 minutes, which were like a sudden burst of light in the midst of impenetrable, unfathomable darkness. A single thought stood out clearly, irrefutably, beyond question. How utterly different everything would be today in this courtroom, in Israel, in Germany, in all of Europe, and perhaps in all countries of the world, if only more such stories could have been told. End of quote. The Anton Schmidt story was one of the factors that prompted Yad Vashem, after the trial was over, to create a special department to research, document, and honor other similar rescuers under the title of Righteous Among the Nations. 5 years later, the Portuguese diplomat Aristides de Sousa Mendes was added to that list. Now, you want to show the clip, please?
If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. And the people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can then do what you please.
Thank you. So at first, the United States was to her the lodestar and paragon of a just society, but the McCarthy hounding of persons accused of communist association, communist true or false, followed by the Vietnam War, diminished in her eyes her past praise of the American democracy. She warned that the greatest danger of tyranny is exactly when it issues from the executive part of the government. She had in mind the Nixon era. The whole fabric of government is at stake when it constantly lies. She warned of governments that destroy themselves from within. But it doesn't have to be this way, she added, since we always have the ability to create a better society, upheld by democratic principles and care for all citizens. She constantly upheld the importance of learning from the past. Quoting William Faulkner, she stated that the past is never dead. It is not even past. Our lives at any moment are part of the world's past. Every moment of the past is also a constant presence. So when the political birds from the past come home to roost, she pleaded to let us at least learn from their past experience to avoid repeating some of their past mistakes. In conclusion, in her advocacy of man as a potentially reasonable being that included honoring the intelligence of other persons, she was basically a child of the Enlightenment, mainly of Kant. She was equally a Zionist and a critic of Zionism. As for Heidegger, still much lauded as an outstanding existential thinker, she could not fully disengage herself from him, her first and true love. The anti-Semitic man and one-time Nazi, who as rector of the Freiburg University expelled his former teacher, the Jewish Edmund Husserl, the proponent of the idea of phenomenology, from the use of the university library facility. Hannah Arendt was basically an optimist, and she remained so, although she was concerned with where society and government sometimes go astray. She was also very loyal to Israel, but she was not without criticizing the way the Palestinian minority in Israel is being treated. Some of their rights are placed in question. And this is something that many people, most of whom are pro-Zionist, are also concerned. So she remains a foremost thinker, and with that, I am finished. And I turn the floor over to Jeff Bieber, please.
Thank you, Mordecai. And thank you, Olivia, for inviting me both to share the film as well as to talk with folks here. And I'm also looking forward to your questions. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and why I helped to create this film. As Olivia mentioned, I worked for the PBS public television station in Washington, D.C. for many years. And I covered a lot of political events. I covered 9/11. I was driving to work actually on South Capitol Street when the first plane hit on 9/11, and I passed the Pentagon a couple of minutes after that was hit. And we went on the air every night. I was executive producing coverage for PBS for 2 weeks straight. And it's very interesting because I remember going home at night, passing the Pentagon, seeing the smoke, smelling the smoke, and seeing anti-aircraft guns all over the place. And it's truly amazing how a road you could travel on for many years all of a sudden changes when you're surrounded by different events. That really changed me in many ways. I covered, as a producer, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I produced a show for many years called Washington Week. Maybe you know it, first with Gwen Ifill and then with Robert Costa. And I was in the control room on January 6th, 2021, when there was basically a riot that took place at the U.S. Capitol during the peaceful transfer of power. And I started to question what was taking place. I had covered the first Trump presidency, and I had a front row seat to everything that was going on. And often, actually, on Friday nights when Washington Week aired, there would be a lot of news breaking. People would think they could bury news on Friday nights because nobody was really watching TV, but a lot of news really broke on Friday nights. I remember that very well. But after the January 6th, and I do call it a riot because Lisa Desjardins, who's still a journalist, a wonderful reporter on Capitol Hill for the PBS NewsHour, was literally under a desk as people were attacking the U.S. Capitol, trying to stop the peaceful transfer of power. And anyway, after that, I started to question what was going on in our country. And I came upon the work of Hannah Arendt. I had read Eichmann in Jerusalem a long time before, but I hadn't really read a number of books that I picked up Origins of Totalitarianism, which, as Mordecai mentioned, is basically her seminal book that was published in 1951, where she questions how did a totalitarianism emerge in Germany and in the Soviet Union during World War II. Soviet Union, obviously, before World War II, during the age of Stalinism. And we focused in this film on Nazi Germany. Hannah Arendt once said in her last unfinished book called Life of the Mind that all thinking comes from one's experience. I'm paraphrasing what she wrote, but she wrote that when she was a little girl growing up in Königsberg, Germany at the time, that's now Kaliningrad in Russia. And Königsberg was the city where Immanuel Kant lived and taught. She would write things down as she was walking through, and she would see things and try to understand what was going on in the world, and she would write it down. And when she was a teenager, at the age of 12 or 13, she started reading Kant, Nietzsche, and other philosophers. I mean, she was, a child prodigy. So I took what she said about in The Life of the Mind, that all thinking comes from one experience, to do a documentary about both her life and her work, because her life really does help inform what happens in Germany during actually the turn of the 20th century, from the 19th to 20th century, and what happens World War I, World War II, post-World War II, in terms of the emergence of totalitarianism. How does it emerge? And how does it impact our lives today? And what I discovered was a person whose life was dramatic, and she often experienced terrifying experiences coming of age in Nazi Germany. After her studies with Heidegger, she goes to Berlin, and she rebounds after her affair with Heidegger and marries a nice Jewish boy in Berlin. And she starts to observe what's happening. They moved to Berlin in 1929, and after the stock market crashes, things go awry in Nazi Germany. And this person who was a soldier in World War I, Adolf Hitler, emerges to be the leader of the far-right party. There's also the Communist Party that's taking place, led by Rosa Luxemburg. And there's a new democratic government that emerges in the Weimar Republic. But she starts to see what's happening with the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. And after Hitler gains power, becomes the chancellor of Germany and turns it into Nazi Germany. In 1933, she joins the resistance. And actually, she works for the German Zionist Party to expose the anti-Semitic propaganda that's taking place in Germany at the time that people outside of Germany are not really aware of. She gets arrested by the Gestapo and spends, well, there's now a little controversy. She spent 8 days. Somebody now thinks she spent 1 day in jail. For whatever reason. She escapes. She gets out. She goes to France. And then she joins Youth Aliyah to help Jewish children, German Jewish children, get out. And at the time, in 1938, all doors are closed to Jews who want to get out of Germany. But she believes that European Jews need a homeland. They need to participate politically, where they've been denied to participate anywhere else. Just to sum it up, while she's in France, she does help Jewish kids escape to Palestine, and she gets arrested again in Gurs, and she escapes again and comes to the United States. And she writes about, how did this happen? How did totalitarianism take place in Nazi Germany? What were the elements that caused totalitarianism to rise? And she writes about the government lies, that they kept saying the same lies over and over and over again, and people started to believe them. And I want to play the first clip of what happened when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party starts to recruit people who never really belonged to any political party. Go ahead.
The Nazi movement recruited their members from this mass of indifferent people, whom all other parties had given up as too apathetic or too stupid for their attention. The result was that the majority of their membership consisted of people who never before had appeared on the political scene.
I think she came up with these ideas when she was looking at what this mass society would provide people. It would provide them with the impression that they're not alone anymore. And there is a party giving them an idea that they are part of something really big.
So basically, let me just give you a little bit of a history lesson here, especially for people who did see the film, or maybe people who didn't see the film. So Hannah Arendt, as Mordecai mentioned, born in 1906, actually in Hanover, Germany, and her family moves to Königsberg. After World War I, during World War I, actually, Hannah and her mother, her father had died, had to escape to Berlin to escape, the oncoming Russians, and then they came back. What she writes about after World War I is that after the Treaty of Versailles, in which the Allied forces forced Germany to demilitarize, they forced Germany to pay reparations. What ensues is hyperinflation, unemployment, and a massive refugee crisis of people leaving what was the formerly Austria-Hungary Empire to find work in Germany. And so what's happening in Germany at the time is somewhat familiar to what's been happening today in terms of a massive refugee crisis. And Adolf Hitler emerges and starts to blame those immigrants who are coming to take jobs away. And he comes on the scene promising actually, as Bahrahan, the person you just saw in that clip, says, to make Germany great again. And he actually did say that in one speech. Um, and so what Hitler does is he sows the public's distrust of institutions. He starts to blame the Weimar Republic when he's campaigning to be chancellor in the 1930s, before he becomes chancellor. He blames the media. He blames cultural institutions. And that's what she writes about. And so he is this, as she writes, this amoral, shameless, strong man who harnesses that unrest, harnesses that anger that people feel about losing their jobs. They felt they were winning the war. This is after World War I, with lies, movement building lies, and slogans and conspiracy theories about the other. And basically, once in power, he's able to attack institutions, right? And so he's basically able to attack the institutions that ground a democratic republic and starts to build the Reichstag, basically a dictatorship. Now, Hannah Arendt writes about three spheres: the public sphere, which is political sphere, where people could participate politically; the private sphere, which is your home; and the social sphere, where you go to clubs, you pray in church or a synagogue. And what she writes about is that typically the tyrant or a dictator wants to control the public sphere. They want to control civil society, cultural centers, universities, right? Telling people what they could read or not read, government, the courts, the public infrastructure. But then what she writes about is in a totalitarian system, the totalitarian leader wants to control the private sphere. They want to control what you think, right? You can't think what doesn't fit the system of the totalitarian government. She also writes about the idea of loneliness, existential loneliness. And actually, she writes about loneliness after she visited Germany in 1949, 1950, saw Heidegger again. In the second edition of Origins of Totalitarianism, she includes a big section at the end, toward the end of the book, about loneliness that wasn't in the first edition of the book. And what she writes about is that after World War I, after the Treaty of Versailles, there's also a huge change taking place in not only in Germany, but all over the world of industrialization, right? You have the telegram, you have people moving away from the rural agrarian community and working in cities. You have the telephone, you have the emergence of mass communication. So the world is changing in addition to hyperinflation, and people are feeling like the lives they felt they knew wasn't existing. So she writes about that people were lonely in the existential sense. They were longing for meaning and belonging, and Hitler provided them with meaning. Hitler providing them with comforting slogans to bring back jobs, to rebuild the military, in essence, to make Germany great again. So, in essence, people were looking for someone to blame, and people, what Adolf Hitler does and the Nazi Party does is they create a conspiracy about the Jews, right? It's the Jews that are really trying to control the world, and we need to have a counter conspiracy to stop that. And in essence, this gets now to Hannah Arendt's relationship with her Jewish identity and Judaism in general. So Hannah Arendt, as a young child in the film, writes about that she encountered anti-Semitism as a young girl. And her mother, very strong-willed woman, basically said to her, when people attack you, you have to defend yourself, right? Don't just take it. You have to defend yourself. What Hannah Arendt says ultimately in this very famous interview she gives to Günter Grass in 1964, she says that she felt that she didn't want to, it's not about defending yourself as a German, as a citizen of the world, but defending yourself as a Jew, because that's what she was. It wasn't that, you know, this big identity. She didn't wear it on her sleeve, but she felt that's how she was seen in German society. And so Arendt early on encounters anti-Semitism. And please put up the picture of her in the 1930s. That's Hannah Arendt in the 1930s. And she starts getting into the letters and the diaries of a woman named Rachel von Hagen. You could put up that little slide, Rachel von Hagen. A friend of hers, Anne Mendelssohn, who is the great, I think, granddaughter, great great granddaughter of the great philosopher Mendelssohn, Moses Mendelssohn, was good friends with Hannah Arendt when they were young. And she gives Hannah Arendt a book of letters and a diary by Rachel von Hagen. Who's Rachel von Hagen? She was a woman born in the 18th century, late 18th century, and lived to the early 19th century. Born Jewish, and at the time, during the Enlightenment period, Jews felt that they could fit into society. They were as good at Germans as anybody else. And yet, what a lot of Jews, especially a lot of German Jews, did is they wanted to hide their Jewishness in order to fit in. So she reads about Rachel's life, and Rachel writes about, she was a big letter writer, and she writes to her friends that she wants to basically hide her Jewishness. She starts a salon. She marries a non-Jew account or somebody in the higher echelon. She converts, right? And she opens a salon and she's friends with Goethe. And yet, at the end of her life, she realizes that no matter how hard she tries, people will always see her as Jewish. And so the point that Hannah Arendt gets out of this is she's writing this book at the time in 1929 when the stock market crashes and Adolf Hitler is blaming the Jews, German Jews who felt that they were safe. A lot of German Jews had fought in World War I. They were good Germans in high society. Surely nothing would happen to them. And during World War I, actually Jews felt very safe. And what Hannah Arendt writes in the book about Rachel von Hagen is that Jewish assimilation was an illusion, that you were never going to be safe. You were always going to be seen as the Jew or a Jew. And she felt that there was two kinds of Jews back then. There was the parvenu, somebody who wanted to have a leg up and fit into German society, and there was the pariah, somebody who would say, you know what, I'm Jewish. You have to accept me as Jewish, and I have to accept myself as Jewish. So when she escapes to France, and she becomes involved in youth aliyah to help Jewish kids get out. And that's her on the ship, taking kids, German Jewish kids to Palestine in 1935. She firmly believed that Jews needed a homeland. And because in 1938, the United States closes their doors to immigration of Jewish people trying to get out, she firmly believes that Palestine should be a homeland for Jews. But what she also says, and she writes about this in the 1940s when she's in the United States, after seeing Ben Gurion talk at a conference called in the Biltmore Hotel, she hears Ben Gurion talk about the creation of a Jewish state, and she doesn't hear any mention of Arabs or Palestinians or Arabs. And she realizes that what's going to happen with this creation of this Jewish state is it's going to be a nation state, a Jewish nation state. And what she's very afraid of, and she writes about this in this article called The Crisis of Zionism, is that nation states is what happened in Germany. So a nation is nationalism. Someone has to fit in. In Germany, it was the Aryan state. Jews were second-class citizens. The state is a state governed by laws. And what she was very afraid of was the Jewish nation state would eliminate and make Arabs second-class citizens. She firmly believed, she worked with a political party in Israel that later became Israel, who advocated to create a federated state, a commonwealth in which Arabs and Jews would govern collectively. And of course, that didn't happen. So she was very afraid of what could happen in the state of Israel. I want to jump ahead now when she's in the United States, and I want to go to the next clip about McCarthyism. and what happens there. Go ahead.
I am not and never have been a member of the Communist Party.
Can you see how far the disintegration has gone, and with what breathtaking speed it has occurred, and up to now, hardly any resistance? The whole entertainment industry, and to a lesser extent, the universities have been dragged into it. It all functions without any force, without any terror. They're introducing police methods, they name names, and in this way, the informant system is being integrated into the society. If you try to make America more American, you only destroy it. Your methods are the justified methods of the police, and only of the police.
Okay, so when she comes to the United States, the thing that she's amazed about is that she doesn't have to pretend to be anybody else other than who she is. She's a German Jew who comes to the United States and can be a German Jew. And so she firmly believes the United States is a republic. She calls this country the republic. She becomes an American citizen in 1951. And she feels that this republic is governed by one thing and one thing only, and that's the Constitution, right? That's how people come together, by the Constitution. In 1949, during when McCarthy comes to the forefront through 1951, McCarthyism obviously goes on a witch hunt, and he's after communists. Her husband at the time, Heinrich Blücher, was a former communist, and he did not say he was a former communist on the ship manifest when he came over. So she was very afraid, he was very afraid, that he would be deported and he would lose his citizenship. And so she saw McCarthyism as a crack in her dear republic to basically go on a witch hunt and not use terror, not use violence, but basically have informants to inform on their fellow Americans that they could be canceled, they could be deported. And she was very afraid that this was a crack in what she called this kind of element of totalitarianism that was seeping into this country. And then I want to go to the Watergate. Why don't you play the next clip?
It was obvious that during Watergate, crimes had been committed, big crimes. But what's amazing is how many people who knew better weren't willing to stand up and stop it. So many people cared more about power than they did about the health of the republic and doing what was right.
Watergate has revealed perhaps one of the deepest constitutional crises this country has ever known. It's the whole fabric of government which is actually at stake. The founding fathers never believed that tyranny could arise out of the executive office. However, we know today that the greatest danger of tyranny is, of course, from the executive.
Now, by the way, all the words that you hear Hannah Arendt say are words taken from interviews she gave, books she wrote, articles she wrote, correspondence. That was her last interview she gives in 1973 to a French journalist, Roger Herrera. And that was in October 1973 at the height of Watergate. And she firmly believed that Watergate showed the danger of what could happen in the United States if the executive, the president, expanded his or her reach beyond what the executive can do. And she was very afraid of what could happen. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with before we get to questions is what she said people can do. What can we do if we see the dangers that befell her in Nazi Germany and what she felt the dangers were in the United States? And I want you to play that last clip, Matthew, and then we could talk on the other side.
I've just come from a student protest meeting against our policy in Vietnam. The whole thing was extremely reasonable and unfanatical, so crowded that one could hardly get through. This generation seems characterized by sheer courage, an astounding will to action, and by a no less astounding confidence in the possibility of social change.
Okay. So basically, what Hannah Arendt said and always said is she believed firmly in people's participation in politics. And she was she was teaching at the New School at the time, and she believed firmly in people's participation to come together and to act together for change. And so civil disobedience was a big part of that. And she firmly supported that, and felt that you couldn't be a bystander. You had to participate if you wanted to save the Republic. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Olivia, and you can open it up to questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Mordecai and Jeff. Before we get to questions, and there are quite a few, I'm going to make some announcements. So this gives you a few extra minutes to type your questions in, and we'll get to as many as we can. And if I don't get to your question, we will send all the questions to our speakers, and we can facilitate responses if they should wish to type out responses to what we don't get to. With that said, let me tell you a little bit about what we have upcoming. So first of all, if you like the programs that we do, I urge you, and it's not too late, to get a season ticket for all of our programs in 2026. And our wonderful intern, Robin, is going to put into the chat box the link for where you can get your season ticket. If you made a donation for today's program or for our programs back in January, we would be happy to apply those toward the cost of a season ticket. And if you need help, just reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention. Second thing I wanted to mention is if you are a teacher in the audience, we still have spaces available for our institute in Portugal on rescue and resistance during the Holocaust. So this will be in July 5th through 13th, and it's a really wonderful experience. This will be our second annual Teacher Institute. So again, if that interests you, please let us know. And now let me tell you very briefly about two upcoming programs. So in 2 weeks, we have our next Sunday program, and it's about the rescue of the Jews of Ethiopia, Operation Solomon, Operation Moses of the 1980s and 90s, a big operation to rescue the Jews, similar in scope to the rescue of other Jews from other communities, and well worth learning about if you don't already know. So that's in 2 weeks' time. We're going to see a film called Jerusalem, and we'll see a trailer in a minute. But now let me mention that 1 week following, which will be on March 1st, we're going to turn to another strong Jewish woman hero, which is our theme for the year. And that will be Henrietta Zold. We've spoken about youth aliyah. Well, she invented it. So that is a program I'm really looking forward to. Filmmaker Abby Ginsberg will be with us. Shulamit Reinhardt, who's in the film, will be with us. And a representative of Hadassah Today, Henrietta Zold, also founded Hadassah. So that is something I'm really looking forward to. And now we're going to see a little trailer to the film Jerusalem.
אני, לפניה, מלך, חי,
אבותינו הקריבו את חייהם כדי שהשבט שלנו ימשיך בקיומו.
אם יגיע את הזמן שאנחנו נוכל לנסוע לארץ ישראל.
ממשלת ישראל לא רוצה להתעסק עם הנושא של עליית יהודי אתיופיה.
אולי הצבע שלנו היה קצת מוזר.
בשביל מה אנחנו מקימים את מדינת ישראל, אם לא בשביל לקבץ את נתחי ישראל בכל המקומות?
עכשיו!
היום, 8 בנובמבר 1981, אנו עומדים לצאת לים האדום על הבת גלים בדרך למבצע נבל בית.
ההורים שלי אמרו לי, אתה עכשיו עולה לבד לירושלים.
דודו, אני זוכר, העליתי לו את הנגלה האחרונה, הוא הסתכל, תגיד לי, הם יהודים החבר'ה האלה? הערף יהודים, אתה ואני גדלנו בקיבוץ. אחת זקנה תופסת את דודו ברגל, אומרת שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו. אז הוא אומר לי בקשר, קבל תיקון, הם יהודים יותר ממני וממך.
מה זה מזכיר לך? אם לא את יציאת מצרים.
אנחנו יהודים כמוכם! כמוכם!
אני רוצה לשאול את עצמי כל בוקר מה אני יכולה לעשות בשביל לשנות את החיים שלי ושל הקהילה שלי.
Okay, so now let's get to your questions, and there are a lot. So let me start with the subject that I mentioned early on in the program, which is Varian Fry. So can we hear a little bit more about Varian Fry, what he did, and how he helped Hannah Arendt and others?
Go ahead, Mordecai.
Yeah, well, it's a long subject. When the Holocaust Museum opened in Washington, D.C., and I was invited there, and there was an exhibit down in the basement on Varian Fry. I never heard of that name. An exhibit of all the documents of Varian Fry, what he, basically he was sent by an American-born organization, Refugee Board, that had been created when France fell. And the Refugee Board asked from the State Department to allow 200 well-known people who were on the Gestapo list, and they had been living in France, former German Jews who had fled from Germany to France, to let them in the United States and disregard the quota that was then enforced for these 200 people. And Eleanor Roosevelt was involved, and the State Department agreed, and they were looking for somebody to go out and get these 200 people. And Varian Fry, who was a journalist, he had been to Nazi Germany on a visit, he was elected to be the emissary to get 200 people out. So he flew into Marseille with a Pan Am Clipper, and he opened an office in Marseille. Marseille was then part of Vichy France. In other words, that part of France, which was not under direct German control, but a government which collaborated with the Germans, Vichy France. And he was looking for these 200 Jews, but then the word got around that here's an American who was making possible for people to get to the United States. So what happened was that more than these, not necessarily these 200 Jews came, but all others who wanted to flee. Now, he didn't have the authority for the other than the 200 names on the list, but he decided he was going to create an organization of his own in France, and he enlisted people, and he got close to 2,000 people out of France across the border into Spain or Portugal or into North Africa or into other places in Latin America. And he finally, he became an annoyance to the Vichy regime and an annoyance to the American government. Many people don't know that the United States maintained diplomatic relations with the Vichy regime, right, until November 1942, when the United States landed its forces in Morocco and Algeria. So the United States had relations with the Vichy regime and tried to steer the Vichy regime away from Nazi Germany. So here is Varian Fry smuggling people out of the Vichy France illegally, and finally he was told by the American diplomat in Marseille to stop it. He refused to stop. They took away his passport, and he was expelled in 1941, in September 41, when the United States still had diplomatic relations with Vichy France. And he came to the United States, and he was a very disappointed person. He lectured Latin in a private school. His marriage broke up, but the French government, before he died in 1981, they gave him the Légion d'honneur. So I discovered all this, and I brought the case before Yad Vashem, the special board that decides on righteous among the nations. He was declared a righteous among the nations. And I have to tell you that there was a ceremony in Jerusalem, which I was one of the directors of the ceremony. And the American Secretary of State came to the ceremony and he apologized for the mistreatment of Varian Fry by his colleagues, his previous colleagues. And he was the first American to be honored as a righteous among the nations, the tree for him at Yad Vashem. And since then, several other Americans have been honored. So he's the first major American who got 2,000 people out of France before the actual killing of the Jews began by the Nazis. It was a time when the Germans allowed Jews to leave, but Vichy France was holding back. And I have to say it, it's uncomfortable to say it, the American government also was holding back. They had a quota system. You had to have affidavits from people in the United States. I just want to mention in passing that Otto Frank tried to get to the United States, and he didn't have enough people in the United States, relatives, to submit affidavits of support. But by the time he received it, it was too late, and he had to go into hiding. Otto Frank, the father of Anna Frank. So this is the story of Varian Fry, honored by Yad Vashem as the righteous among the nations.
So we are reaching the end of the hour, but I'm going to ask both the speakers and the audience to stay over a few extra minutes because I'd like to get to some more questions. So one question is, here she is, she's a German Jew, she loses her citizenship, escapes through Czechoslovakia to France, is imprisoned at Gurs, somehow escapes to Gurs, gets rescued by Varian Fry, ends up via Lisbon in the United States. And yet, she did not want to consider herself to be a refugee. She doesn't like that word. Why? What did she have against, Jeff, maybe? What did she have against that word, refugee?
Yeah. Well, she when she comes to the United States, she writes this searing, powerful essay called "We Refugees." And basically, in the kind of the first couple of paragraphs of that essay, she basically says something like, "Don't call us refugees. We were, we didn't leave, voluntarily. Don't call persecuted people by Hitler in the Holocaust refugees. We escaped." So she writes this searing, very powerful, very emotional, heartfelt essay, basically about how we left people in the ghettos, we left people in the camps, and we came here and we lost everything. And at any rate, she felt that we were human beings. We're human beings, and the thing that she also wrote about is that people who are stateless don't have rights. And she writes about the rights of man. I mean, isn't the rights of man, in the Declaration of Independence, in the Enlightenment in France, and yet people who don't have state recognition, don't have citizenship, loses everything, loses all rights. So she writes about that. And her work is actually quite resonant, as many of what she wrote about what's happening today in the United States and all over the world. So that's why she didn't like the word refugees.
So what I'm understanding is that she used to be considered quite controversial. When she published her book on Eichmann in Jerusalem, it made people angry. Is she still controversial? I mean, it sounds like she's prophetic. I mean, how do we see her now today?
Well, it's interesting. And maybe Mordecai and I could talk about this. I think there are definitely people who are still angry with her about what she wrote in Eichmann in Jerusalem. And it's a complicated thing, a book to read. If you read the book, and I would encourage people to read this book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. Basically, it's written in a very ironic and actually angry tone. And what people don't recognize or don't really give credence to is the fact that Hannah Arendt herself was a survivor who's in prison in Nazi Germany by the Gestapo. She gets out, and she's imprisoned again when the French government orders all German citizens to be in prison in Gurs. And it was horrible there. And she gets out. She was only there for 6 weeks, and she gets out again. And when she goes to cover the Eichmann trial for the New Yorker, she says to her friend Mary McCarthy, she wants to see a Nazi in the flesh because she felt like she got out in 33. So she got out earlier and she wants to see a Nazi in the flesh. And one of the things she says and writes about, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but she was angry at Ben-Gurion and the prosecutor Hausner, because basically what she writes about is they're painting Eichmann like all the other anti-Semites in the centuries or millennium of anti-Semites like Haman and others. And basically she says they're ignoring what the real issue was, that Eichmann was, basically like many other people who were doing their job. Yes, they were anti-Semites. She says Eichmann was an anti-Semite, but they were doing their job and they were putting people in cattle cars as if, as Leon Botstein says, they were boxing cereal to send thousands of people to their deaths. And what she says is the totalitarian system swept everyone into the system, including the Jewish Judenrechte. And she says that Jews did resist. She never said Jews didn't resist, but she also says that people cooperated with Eichmann, including the Jewish councils. And people were really angry that she would say that. And her good friend, Gershom Shalom, and also Hans Jonas, broke off ties with her. Because they said she was saying Eichmann was banal and she's blaming the Jews for the Holocaust, which she didn't say, she didn't write. But nevertheless, her book punctured a lot of things that people held. You have to remember this is 1963, when the book is 63, when the book is published, or it comes out in the New Yorker articles, and no one had really saw the survivors, thought, and it really changed a lot of things in Israel that Mordecai could talk about. But there's a lot of truth in the book in terms of how you see people who could drop bombs on innocent people because they're following orders. They could drop bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end the war, where thousands of innocent civilians are killed. So basically, you have to question the sense of what she means by banality of evil, that they're not thinking about what they're doing, they're following their orders, basically. So it does raise a lot of questions about.
If I may, I would like to add something to what Jeff is saying. Before she wrote the book on Eichmann, Raoul Hilberg, an historian, wrote a book, a major study called The Destruction of European Jews.
Right.
He wrote it like a year or two before she wrote. And he also was very critical of the Jewish leadership, the Judenrate inside Europe and the Jewish leadership in general. And he was also criticized, but he wasn't attacked so viciously as she was attacked. And I think that because she was a woman, it was easier to attack her. If she had been a man, she would have been criticized, but she would have been honored. She would have been invited to conferences where she could have explained the viewpoint. But at that time, for women to attack Jewish leadership, that was unthinkable. I think that anti-femininity also played a certain role. I want to say that a few days ago, I listened to a talk on YouTube by Brett Steffens of the New York Times, speaking at the 92 White Center on anti-Semitism, where he demeaned Jew hatred as basically an incurable mental illness that no reasonable responses could help eliminate. Therefore, he counsels that one should take anti-Semitism in stride and not be too much concerned about it. Hannah Arendt would have sharply disagreed with him. As she once stated, and I will read now from the slide, I expressed it then when the Nazis took over, and time and again, if you are attacked as a Jew, you must defend yourself as a Jew, not as a German or a world citizen and upholder of the rights of man, which also have to be mentioned. But as a Jew, you have to attack, you have to respond, and not overlook it and say, "Oh, anti-Semitism has always been there," and so there's nothing we can do about it. That was the mistake of European Jewry when Nazism came to the fore. It was excused, but in Germany it will never happen. Perhaps in Poland and Russia, because people remember the pogroms. There were no pogroms in modern Germany. There were a lot of pogroms in Poland and Russia and other East European places. That's where the danger was. So they overlooked it. So I think that she realized that when you're, as she said, you're attacked as a Jew, you defend yourself first as a Jew. This is my comment.
So I would like to give my profound thanks to our two remarkable speakers, Dr. MORDECAI PALDIEL and Jeff Bieber, our filmmaker. Thank you to our audience who comes faithfully to all of our programs. See you in 2 weeks for the program about the rescue of the Jews of Ethiopia. Be well, enjoy the Olympics, enjoy the Super Bowl. See you next time. Have a wonderful day. Stay warm. Be well. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.